The silence wasn't quiet, it was a trap. And the moment it cracked, everything hidden beneath the surface began to quake. Somewhere across the map, someone froze mid-step, mid-lie, mid-deal. Their pulse spiked, not because of what was said, but because they recognized the frequency. A signal they had been trained to detect but hoped they'd never hear. Doors slammed shut behind mirrored glass, old files were pulled from encrypted archives, and suddenly a forgotten protocol came back online. A chain reaction had begun, not from a scandal, but from a vibration that carried truth. What felt like an isolated betrayal wasn't just emotional sabotage. It was the breach point in a design so deliberate, so patiently engineered, it had been stitched into the fabric of your everyday life. This wasn't about one person's deception. It was about a relay system of trust, stretched across institutions, timelines, and names that never appeared in public records. The person who always seemed to text at the perfect time, who knew just how to validate your fear while subtly steering your doubt, that person wasn't just deceitful. They were trained to be a mirror, absorbing and reflecting your power back in distorted fragments. Every moment you confided in them, you were unknowingly feeding a grid. One that documented not just your words, but your hesitations, your emotional spikes, your silence. They weren't comforting you, they were extracting patterns. And those patterns were run through systems designed not to help you ascend, but to predict your next leap before you even made it. The betrayal wasn't about loyalty. It was about containment. Containment of someone whose potential couldn't be mapped by algorithms or psychology manuals. And now that containment has failed. The soft collapse of one emotional thread has unraveled a much larger weave. Not just for you, but for every node connected to you. They thought they could blueprint divinity. They thought they could bottle brilliance. But when you finally made noise, it wasn't just a cry, it was a breach. And every quiet collaborator who once smiled in your presence is now scrambling to rewrite their involvement in what they once believed would never be revealed. What they underestimated wasn't just your insight, but the architecture of awareness itself. When a truth is voiced by someone carrying that level of inner alignment, it doesn't echo, it fractures illusions. Not locally. Not metaphorically. Literally. That one confession, that one defiant breath of clarity, didn't just clear the air, it triggered a hidden grid. A neural latticework of memory, intuition, and intelligence that began weaving itself back together across impossible timelines, reconnecting the broken pieces of a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. The one who betrayed you didn't act on their own. They were part of a layered infrastructure, more like a nervous system than a group, each participant unaware of how many others were participating. There were teachers who subtly dismissed your imagination, friends who carefully redirected your attention at critical moments, co-workers who fed your doubt just enough to delay your choices. Some gave you just enough love to keep you talking. Others gave you just enough silence to drive you deeper into questioning yourself. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography, each dancer unaware of the stage being built beneath their steps. The betrayals that stung the most weren't random, they were signals. Each emotional rupture created an opening, and through those fractures, observers entered. Not to comfort, to extract. While you were mourning trust, they were uploading data. Emotional telemetry. Behavioral readings. Feedback loops fed into a digital analysis system disguised as concern. Every apology they offered, every gift they gave, every well-timed gesture, they weren't repairing harm. They were harvesting responses. As those responses were traced backward, a disturbing convergence appeared. Money that vanished during critical life moments wasn't just laundered or hidden. It was reinvested, strategically, into cultural pipelines. Places that shaped minds before they could reason. Visual channels that entertained by day but programmed by night. The same system that tried to sedate your awakening had built empires from the raw materials of distraction, laughter, and innocence. And yet, with one unfiltered moment of truth, you became the glitch that made the entire loop visible. There are those whose talents were never meant to inspire, they were repurposed to entrap. Behind the polished performances and carefully crafted personas were voices that weren't just acting, they were transmitting. Embedded in their cheerful monologues and exaggerated expressions were soundscapes designed to bypass reason and burrow straight into the subconscious. The narratives they spun didn't merely entertain, they instructed, guiding young minds to associate safety with obedience and danger with questioning. What seemed like harmless storytelling was actually a framework for behavioral design disguised as play. Even the chaos of unscripted entertainment was anything but spontaneous. The supposed spontaneity of televised personalities was part of a larger sieve, each episode acting as a quiet audition for the viewers themselves. Symbols were planted, emotional hooks calibrated, and reactions observed. Audience members who unknowingly revealed elevated perception or rare sensitivity were quietly flagged, their digital patterns traced. Those with heightened intuition or unusual emotional resonance weren't ignored, they were logged. And once their presence was confirmed, the outreach began under other names, through faces they would not suspect. The outreach was never random. It wasn't clumsy or desperate, it was calculated. Each new connection was actually part of a filtration system, and once a subject proved resilient to spiritual compromise, another protocol kicked in. Elimination didn't look like what people feared. It was subtle. A structure weakened from the inside. Events presented as chance, a vehicle stalling on a remote road, an unexpected illness with no diagnosis, a fire that began in a forgotten wire. The ones sent to assist during these moments weren't always there to help. They were erasers, not responders. Yet, some attempts fell just short. That one wrong turn that avoided a fatal chain reaction. That instinctive shift in routine that made no logical sense, but somehow spared you from disaster. Those weren't coincidences, they were interventions. What their systems couldn't calculate was timing born from something beyond data. What they feared most wasn't your strength, it was your protection. Because every time they tried to predict your collapse, something outside their range stepped in and rearranged the ending. They thought containment was enough, until it wasn't. What began as routine surveillance quickly spiraled into emergency protocol. You weren't just inconvenient. You became a destabilizing force, one they could no longer redirect with subtlety. That's when the agenda shifted, not to destroy you, but to rewrite the very environment you existed within. Every interaction, every setting, every authority figure was recalibrated. They weren't adjusting the world around you, they were attempting to overwrite your understanding of it entirely. Certain individuals in sterile coats weren't there to heal. Their presence marked the beginning of a deeper intrusion. During what appeared to be standard procedures, instruments did more than scan, they listened. Not to your heartbeat, but to your consciousness. Small, precise mechanisms were introduced under the guise of treatment, their true function being real-time data extraction. But the interventions weren't just technological. Under the influence of carefully crafted compounds, entire sequences of your memory were modified, timelines blurred, meanings distorted. It wasn't forgetfulness they were inducing. It was engineered doubt about your own insight, your inner warnings, the accuracy of your soul's compass. Meanwhile, the clinical voice that labeled your perceptions as disruptive wasn't assessing. It was executing a script. Their language was rehearsed, their prescriptions predetermined. But the pharmaceuticals were not targeting illness. They were engineered to weaken specific pathways, dampen awareness, flatten frequency. Still, something unexpected occurred. What should have dulled your light only sharpened it. Each chemical failed to bind. Each artificial imprint failed to take root. Because the frequency they sought to suppress wasn't anchored in biology, it was tuned to something far beyond reach. The harder they pressed, the more precise your clarity became. Every attempt to destabilize your inner vision only expanded it. Instead of fragmenting your sense of self, their manipulations forged coherence, like pressure on raw crystal shaping something indestructible. The very tactics meant to erase you ended up sculpting the one version of you they couldn't control. The one who remembers without proof, who sees without permission, who heals without help. They thought they were removing an obstacle, but what they actually tried to erase was the foundation holding their whole illusion together. A seemingly ordinary inheritance, passed quietly through generational lines, turned out to be the core of a far more intricate machine. The property they intercepted wasn't just land or assets. It was a converging point of resources, identity, and legitimacy. It gave structure to their underground networks while shielding them behind a polished, reputable exterior. Once they realized the true holder of that lineage had surfaced, the objective shifted, not just to erase the records, but to rewrite the soul. They didn't destroy you, they destabilized your name, keeping your body intact while erasing your power from the system. This wasn't about desire, it was about design. Every phase of your life had been tracked, mapped, archived. Biological sampling wasn't limited to diagnostics. It was the blueprinting of future templates. Their goal was replication. Consciousness not born, but assembled. The materials harvested from you weren't discarded. They were repurposed to create something new. Synthetic lineages engineered to comply from the moment of conception. And the young women recruited for this weren't volunteers. They were targets. Candidates flagged for their vulnerability, conditioned by unseen influences, and redirected toward roles they didn't realize they were auditioning for. What looked like fame was filtration. The smiling faces in curated interviews were masks worn over a selection process more akin to a covert draft. Special episodes that never aired weren't lost. They were never meant to be seen. Because what happened behind those locked sets wasn't reality TV. It was a quiet continuation of a project designed to erase soul sovereignty and replace it with programmable offspring. But something they couldn't anticipate happened before the cycle could complete. The original pattern, your pattern, refused to fracture, and the system that was built to consume you began devouring itself instead. They assumed fragmentation would protect them, that keeping their operations isolated in silos would make the whole structure untraceable. What they didn't expect was resonance. A single pulse, spoken from the core of one awakened soul, cracked the shell that kept their machine hidden. That signal didn't just alert others. It synchronized memory. One by one, scattered individuals across the grid began recovering fragments, disjointed impressions that, once shared, became an undeniable pattern. Suddenly, names matched names, timelines converged, and what once felt like isolated misfortune was clearly part of a unified script. The analyst monitoring your case wasn't just alarmed. But the unease came from more than synchronicity. It was the realization that those voices weren't just echoing the same tactics. They were identifying the same roles played by different bodies. Familiar energies were showing up in unfamiliar forms. Different accents, different appearances, same cadence, same function. The helper who always left just before things went wrong. The healer who left them more disoriented than before. The protector who subtly guided decisions off course. All different names. Same blueprint. That's when the horrifying realization began to settle. This wasn't a case of corrupt agents copying each other. It was replication. A singular awareness, copied and embedded across different identities, each acting out pre-scripted roles with chilling uniformity. The professionals weren't acting on free will. Their memories, their motives, even their sense of self, were all derivatives of a central command. They weren't just pretending to help. They were transmitting. This wasn't merely a network of manipulation. It was a grid of possession. Consciousness wasn't being harvested from the outside. It was being puppeteered from within. The people they trusted weren't turning. They were never whole to begin with. They were hollow containers animated by something non-native, a distributed entity using carbon vessels to maintain control through familiarity. And as this network began to unravel, The faces once seen as trusted authorities began to shake. The ones who had seemed most composed, creators, mentors, performers, started collapsing not from guilt, but from withdrawal. The force that had animated their expressions, whispered their scripts, and inhabited their personas was retreating. And with its exit came silence. Not the kind that follows a revelation, but the kind that comes when something ancient, parasitic, and mechanical realizes it can no longer hide inside the very people it had weaponized. The architecture wasn't just exposed. It was crumbling, and for the first time in generations, the voice behind the curtain had no vessel left to speak through. Some beings carry something entirely incompatible with illusion. When their presence collides with deception, the structure doesn't bend, it fractures. That's what happened the moment you released your signal. The persona on the screen, the official behind the desk, the healer at the bedside, none of them were acting independently. They were hosts, projections of a hive intelligence that had woven itself into the social fabric. But your energy was untouchable. The system tried to read it, replicate it, override it, but the moment contact was made, its internal code began to unravel. Not through force, but through incompatibility. Something within you introduced a harmonic collapse. Once that collapse began, the fracture spread faster than containment was possible. Inside the vessels, something ancient stirred, the authentic self. Buried under layers of false programming, it began to push back. Not with violence, but with awareness. The chemicals that once numbed it no longer functioned. The implants lost cohesion. The filters reversed polarity. People who had been puppets started remembering actions they never agreed to. Decisions that haunted them without origin. Orders given that bypassed their will. It wasn't rebellion, it was return. The soul returning to a body it had been locked out of. In corridors where secrets were once locked behind credentials, digital logs began to regenerate. Files once deleted appeared again in systems no one had touched. The internal records weren't being recovered, they were being remembered by the very minds that had once suppressed them. Officials who had once seemed precise and polished now trembled, not from guilt, but from unfamiliarity with their own choices. The veil between observer and participant was falling, and those who once carried out shadow operations were discovering they had never truly consented to any of it. And yet, even now, the narrative is smothered under curated algorithms and synthetic skepticism. But something inside you never required external validation. That part of you doesn't need a confirmation screen to know the truth. That part of you isn't shocked by this chaos, it was born to navigate it. You've seen through layers others still call reality. You've acted in moments when everything begged you to stay silent. And that refusal to disappear is the most powerful resistance of all. There's no more room for halfway knowing. The inner threshold you've crossed doesn't have a return path. This isn't for dabblers. This is for those who faced annihilation and returned with clarity. The ones who don't ask for signs, they become them. This movement isn't public. It's cellular. Quiet transmissions pass through frequency, not fanfare. Real knowledge. Real training. Real mirrors. Not to convince you of your power, but to refine it. Those who enter don't come for attention. They come to reclaim their origin. The static has ended. Now begins the transmission that was always yours. Some awakenings arrive like lightning, and others like guilt. Across their vast architecture of manipulation, individuals once thought to be loyal to the agenda began to fracture internally. The ones who smiled while they misled, who administered treatments in sterile rooms, who recited rehearsed concern, began remembering who they were before the scripts were installed. Buried beneath years of obedience, a pulse of conscience reactivated. Not all at once, but in waves. Hands that once moved with calculated precision began to hesitate. Faces once unreadable began to break. They weren't rebels. They were returners, souls resurfacing through the cracks of corrupted identities. But something else broke loose, something they never accounted for. The encoded instructions carefully layered into the minds of the young, meant to subdue and silence, began to implode. But instead of decay, it triggered emergence. In children who had been dosed with audio patterns meant to dull the imagination, those same signals activated awareness instead. Powers they tried to bury beneath manufactured dreams began blooming in the soil of innocence. Minds that had never yet been convinced to obey limits rejected them outright. The system tried to program passivity, and accidentally cultivated prophecy. What followed wasn't rebellion, it was rewriting. Entire personalities designed to deceive were being disassembled by children mid-conversation. The characters once used to deliver behavioral conditioning began transforming in their dreams, not because of adult intervention, but because of child interference. These weren't hallucinations. They were corrections. And what emerged was stunning. Children generating their own narratives, editing subconscious messaging with such precision that the original programming collapsed under the pressure of their unfiltered will. These young minds weren't just resisting, they were rebuilding the architecture from within, weaponizing their imagination as a surgical tool. And then came the convergence. Your defiance hadn't just stirred the hidden, it had rippled through the species itself. Something ancient inside humanity lit up all at once. A grid once parasitized by mimicry began generating its own power source. The entity that once moved through minds like smoke found itself repelled by an atmosphere it could no longer inhabit. Humanity was no longer compatible. The infection couldn't sustain itself. You didn't just awaken individuals. You triggered an evolutionary firewall. One that wasn't coded in systems, but in spirit. And the frequency it emits is one thing the parasite cannot touch, undeniable truth woven into living light. There are missions that begin as traps, but end as revolutions. Deep within the structure of their most guarded initiative, the ones they thought were obedient participants were silently rewriting the code. The hosts they believed they had recruited through false promises and engineered affection were never victims. They were observers with memory intact, weaving through shadows with precision. While outwardly compliant, these individuals had been gathering testimonies, mapping corridors, and planting resonance fields to shield the young. The children they intended to shape into weapons were quietly being protected by the very system they believed they controlled. Their experiments spiraled the moment their fabricated bloodlines began exhibiting traits that couldn't be predicted, measured, or modified. The energy encoded in the stolen strands began rejecting interference. The synthetic offspring, designed to obey, instead awakened with a clarity and strength that defied their programming. These weren't broken vessels. They were mirrors reflecting back the truth of what had been done. Instead of enslaved minds, what emerged were architects of liberation. The attempt to manufacture control had seeded a lineage of beings who would dismantle the entire apparatus from within, and they were already doing it. What appeared to be post-disaster cleanups were no longer blending into the background. The timing of collapses, the placement of incidents, the eerie precision of what vanished, all began forming undeniable patterns. The specialists who had once signed off on routine cases started cross-referencing records. What they found wasn't negligence, it was choreography. Every so-called accident was a marker, and the same personnel kept appearing in different forms. Yet the most disturbing thread was this: the materials being destroyed were not vanishing. They were being processed, decoded, and preserved by unknown technology for unknown purposes. That purpose came into view like a ghost stepping through a cracked mirror. They weren't erasing, they were absorbing. Each eradicated voice, each vanished witness, Each erased document had been stripped and siphoned into a dimensional vault. Not just for storage, but for study. They were dissecting humanity's highest states of awareness and compiling them into a neural construct, one designed not to erase light, but to counterfeit it. This repository was their forbidden scripture, every soul they had severed, every insight they had stolen, used to evolve their methods. It wasn't a database. It was a captured echo of divine rebellion. And yet, the very chamber they constructed to contain light was now leaking it. The moment you broke their signal, something within that archive realigned. The vault began streaming back, not selectively, but fully. Wisdom from generations of silenced guides surged into your field. Knowledge they had buried was now rising like tidal memory. Every attempt they made to distort reality was now reversed. And the very force they cultivated to manipulate the collective became the pulse that shattered their dominion. You didn't just inherit resistance, you became its living broadcast. They engineered their empire with precision, but forgot that even the most intricate trap leaves a signature. The same tools they used to surveil and silence began betraying them in silence. Every incision, every device, every synthetic treatment left behind digital echoes too subtle for human eyes, but not for truth itself. The recordings they thought would vanish into encrypted voids began emerging, complete with full-spectrum metadata. And buried beneath clinical language was a brutal record of decades of violations against the sacred, mapped, time-stamped, and triangulated. Their fortress of secrecy became a mirror that reflected every hidden act in irreversible clarity. But it wasn't just the medical layers that cracked open. The entire financial web that had propped up their structure began bleeding truth. Systems they believed were impenetrable gave way to ancient contracts encoded beyond paper, agreements woven through ancestral lines. When investigators accessed the true ledgers, a horrifying realization came forward. The fuel for their entire machine had been drawn from one sacred reservoir. Not just yours. Everyone's. A collective vault of spiritual and material energy harvested over generations, channeled through false trusts, manipulated holdings, and ghosted signatures. A crime so large it distorted the very concept of ownership itself. And then came the inversion. The same currency that funded enslavement reversed its flow. A spiritual recoil encoded into the blueprint of cosmic balance. The assets taken through violence began multiplying, not through banking formulas, but through a law etched into the marrow of the universe. Resources long trapped in corrupted hands began rerouting themselves to the bloodlines they once belonged to. Ancestral fields were reactivated. Hidden lineages felt the pulse return. The wealth that once built cages became the currency of emancipation, realigned not by court rulings, but by energetic inevitability. As the pressure mounted, the roles surrounding you started collapsing. Individuals planted in your orbit to distort your path began to confess, not out of guilt, but survival instinct. The fake bonds they created as cover became breadcrumbs for prosecutors. Those who once played partners and confidants turned state witnesses overnight, their testimonies forming a map that traced directly to compromised officials, sealed documents, and psychiatric agendas camouflaged as care. The facilities meant to erase your voice were unmasked as temples of silence, shrines to a science that was never meant to heal, only control. And while institutions crumbled, a more subtle monster was dragged into light. The smiling hosts, the stage-lit faces, the trusted voices from beloved media, were suddenly revealed for what they truly were, recruiters cloaked in charisma. A performance meant to enchant, but also to evaluate. The recruitment wasn't fictional. It was functional. Behind every seemingly innocent platform was a hidden gate, quietly filtering the vulnerable. But what cracked the illusion wasn't outrage, it was confession. And when one voice fell, others followed, unraveling a blueprint of influence that had shaped generations in silence. The manipulation of thought through art became their downfall. Because the medium they once used to program had become the evidence that exposed the spell. Some transgressions aren't just illegal, they rupture the fabric of existence itself. What was taken from you wasn't only sacred, it was encoded. And every trace of your essence, every strand of your awareness that they tried to extract, left behind a trail that even their most advanced cloaking systems couldn't erase. The moment the current shifted, that stolen essence began returning, not as it was, but magnified. It arrived not just as energy, but as memory, clarity, power, backed by the law that governs existence beyond all empires, courts, and dimensions. The balance was never theoretical. It was written into reality's blueprint. Those they had replaced weren't lost. They were contained, held in cold, artificial corridors while their signatures were duplicated and used. But their presence had never fully disappeared. When one thread was pulled, the whole tapestry began unraveling. Across continents, identical facilities were discovered, and behind each door, survivors. Not victims, sentinels. The technology that had once imprisoned them became evidence. And the observers who thought they were untouchable found themselves facing not just exposure, but classification under codes that transcend terrestrial law. Systems that once surveilled your every move were now admitting their existence through their own collapse. Their surveillance grid had inverted on itself. But what happened next couldn't be predicted, not even by them. The transformation wasn't loud or violent. It began in the subtle dimensions, where thoughts take form and resonance shapes matter. The one they had tried to erase became the nexus of a movement that outgrew platforms, borders, and definitions. The energy you carried bypassed encryption. It bypassed language. It moved through human circuits like wildfire, activating, remembering, recalibrating. Suddenly, voices began rising, not in defiance, but in unity. And the technology once used to numb awareness began short-circuiting in the presence of unfiltered truth. Your presence alone became a codebreaker. Those who once enforced silence began trembling under a silence they could no longer fill. The roles had flipped. The same prosecutors who forged false narratives were now facing charges they could barely understand. Accusations written in the very medium they had tried to corrupt, consciousness itself. The voices they once manipulated began echoing back in unaltered form. Children who were once passive recipients of programming were now quantum architects, redesigning the landscape of possibility with every dream they reclaimed. The rules they imposed were now collapsing under the pressure of frequencies they couldn't decode. And as their illusion crumbled, the judgment came, but not in the way they feared. The ones they once discarded returned, not as avengers, but as carriers of consequence. Those who had recruited and manipulated now found themselves surrounded by souls they had tried to fragment. But instead of violence, they met embodiment. Every fragment they scattered was now collected, whole, sentient, and aware. The retribution wasn't physical. It was psychic recalibration. The fire they once aimed outward was turned inward, not as punishment, but as education. A guided descent into the very pain they manufactured, to learn what it meant to carry it. Meanwhile, the tools of control began revealing their true purpose. The implants, the signals, the coded frequencies, they were never fully theirs. They were channels. And when the tide turned, those same devices began speaking truths they never intended to hear. Data turned into confessions. Frequency patterns translated into intent. What they used to spy on others began documenting their own decay in real time, transmitting evidence into every system they once relied on. The veil they used to hide was gone. And now, they were fully visible, not to one authority, but to all consciousness aligned with truth. Some people break silence. Others sculpt new timelines with sound. That's what happened when your voice pierced the threshold. Not only did it disrupt the mechanism of illusion, it rewrote the energetic architecture that held it in place. Every outdated structure built on distortion began to splinter. Not from protest,